Just a disclaimer for this video. Uh, there are people who like Tom Holland more than Tobey Maguire, and those people are going to die. The 2002 star-studded film Spider-Man, directed by Sam Raimi, featuring actors like Tobey Maguire, Kirsten Dunst, James Franco, Willem Dafoe, and J.K. Simmons, holds a special place in the hearts of millennials and Generation Z alike, many having watched the film as young children, in awe of seeing the web-slinging, crime-fighting, quip-remarking superhero on the big screen. Prior to the 2002 Spider-Man, superheroes severely lacked a presence in Hollywood, save a few exceptions, which were frequently nothing more than lackluster. Prior to Spider-Man, the only experiences audience had with superhero movies were a plethora of Batman movies, Blade, Christopher Reeves' Superman, and then just a whole lot of movies that few people watched. Superhero movies had either been very dark, very cheesy, or both. So very often, it is both. While cheesy at times, Spider-Man was intentional with its awkwardness and was far different from the superhero movies of the past. Today I'm asking the question, is Spider-Man as special and great as we remember? Although I, the reviewer, hold a bias for the film, Spider-Man, due to it being important to my childhood, I will try to be as objective as possible in this review of the film.
Spider-Man is a 2002 dramatic superhero film based on the popular comic book character Peter Parker, played by Tobey Maguire. In the film, Peter Parker is a nerdy 16-year-old who often gets bullied by the stronger, popular athletic students in his school. Due to his parents being inexplicably out of the picture, Peter lives with his uncle Ben Parker, played by Cliff Robertson, and Aunt May Parker, played by Rosemary Harris, in a humble home in Queens, New York. It is made clear very quickly that Peter has a massive crush on his neighbor, Mary Jane Watson, played by Kirsten Dunst, mostly referred to as MJ. As Peter Parker refers to Mary Jane Watson as the woman I've loved since before I even liked girls in his beginning narration, she can be seen with her boyfriend, Flash Thompson, played by Joe Manganiello. His arm is around her. Flash is one of Peter's aforementioned bullies, and the most frequent to bully Peter throughout the movie. At school, Peter's soon-to-be best and only friend, Harry Osborn, played by James Franco, is introduced while he talks to his father, Norman Osborn, played by Willem Dafoe. It is clear that Harry's family is very wealthy, and when Norman meets Peter outside of the school, Peter is evidently a huge fan of Norman's work, and Norman is very impressed with Peter's scientific knowledge. This conversation births the famous line, You know, I'm something of a scientist myself. Harry clearly has a slight resentment towards Peter Parker for how impressed Norman is with Peter. On a field trip to Norman Osborn's science company, Peter gets bit by a radioactive spider. This causes him to pass out shortly after school, and awaken to find that he no longer needs to wear glasses in order to see. He also has abs now. Wow! Peter additionally finds that he can climb walls, shoot webs, do unbelievable acrobatics, and sense when danger is near. Peter Parker has now become the titular character, Spider-Man. Parallel to Peter's abilities being discovered, Norman Osborn is also discovering his powers. Norman and Peter are both discovering their abilities at the same time, but Norman's abilities also drive him into madness. The experimental drug that Norman takes causes him to get incredible strength, as well as form a second identity that acts in order to benefit Norman's life through violent means. Peter goes on to start participating in some underground wrestling with his newfound strength and abilities in order to get money for a car to impress Mary Jane Watson. After winning a cage fight with a giant wrestler, Peter gets ripped off by the man running the underground wrestling ring, so he lets a criminal rob the man who ripped Peter off. The robber goes on to, spoiler alert, kill Peter's Uncle Ben. Peter tries to avenge his uncle, which causes the robber to die. As the story progresses, Norman gets a more developed second identity that acts independently from Norman, doing things that he does not approve of. This other identity, which can be referred to as the Green Goblin, finds out that the vigilante that has been stopping his violent acts, Spider-Man, is actually his son's best friend, Peter Parker. The Green Goblin begins targeting Peter's loved ones, which greatly escalates Peter and the Green Goblin's conflict. Now, hopefully, the audio for that wasn't too bad. There's plenty for symbolism in this movie, but I have just a couple things. So the robber is representative of the consequences of revenge in a few ways. Peter, when in the underground wrestling building after his cage match, lets the robber go to get revenge on the man who rips him off. This results in the death of Peter's Uncle Ben. It teaches Peter that rage-blinded, vengeful actions are not the answer to his issues. Almost. To elaborate on the aforementioned almost situation, Peter doesn't quite learn his lesson, as he follows the robber/murderer into an abandoned warehouse. As the robber/murderer begs for a second chance, Peter screams, "What about my uncle? Did you give him a second chance?" right before causing the death of the robber. At first, Peter is a bit satisfied by what he considers to be justice, but he ends up speaking to his Aunt May about the whole situation. Aunt May is carrying boxes out of her house in the driveway as her and Peter have the discussion. Aunt May explains that she believes Spider-Man is a good man and would never kill another person. It goes against the sixth commandment, after all. This causes Peter to rethink his actions, but it's too late. The robber/murderer is already dead. Also, this is an interesting situation because I look bad. This is an interesting situation because it's actually the first of two times that this happens where because the bad guy is trying to hurt Spider-Man, the bad guy actually dies. This happened the first time with this robber/murderer, the murderer of Uncle Ben. And then it's going to happen a second time at the very end of the movie with the Green Goblin or Norman. Kind of unclear who he is at that. Definitely the Green Goblin, because Norman is begging for his life, and then the Green Goblin, meanwhile, is plotting killing Spider-Man/Peter Parker as Norman begs for his life. And it's kind of unclear if Norman is really saying these things or if the Green Goblin is pretending to be Norman, because the Green Goblin could just be using Norman's real pleading as a distraction, where it's actually a genuine plea, or the Green Goblin could just be pretending to be Norman, pleading for his life. It's somewhat unclear which comic book should be read to compare to the movie. Thousands of Spider-Man comic books exist, but I decided to review the very first comic book featuring the character of Spider-Man. Amazing Fantasy number 15, written by Stan Lee and illustrated by Steve Ditko, is Peter Parker's first appearance, the origin story of the origin story. Spider-Man is actually shockingly accurate to the very first comic book. Here's another spoiler alert. Go watch the movie. Read the comic books if you want to. So these are notable similarities to the comic book. First of all, Peter being a high school student. This is common in Spider-Man stories, but sequels often end up with Peter being graduated from high school and pursuing photography, as it is the case with these films and the comic books. Peter being bit by a radioactive spider is another thing. This seems to be consistent with all versions of Spider-Man's story. It's actually considered a canon event. At the time that I wrote this, I didn't know about canon events. They weren't. The new Spider-Verse movie hadn't been out, but yeah, that's a canon event. Also, Peter being bullied incessantly by Flash Thompson specifically and his friends. It's also something consistent with just about all tellings of Peter Parker's story. It's a core part of his character. Also, Flash Thompson dating a girl that Peter likes. Flash Thompson is dating the girl Peter has a crush on in both the film and the comic book. Peter having to wait for the girl he likes as he watches someone else date her seems to be an integral part of his character. Yeah, it seems to be something that that builds his character. It's crucial to who he is. And it kind of, yeah, it builds who he is. And I'm sure it makes him a better like partner later on, that he is having to kind of be patient and wait. Also, Peter living with his Aunt May and Uncle Ben is both in the movie and the comic book. It's another thing that helps build Peter's character in all versions. It's important to the story that Peter not have the luxury of wealth, physical ability, or parents. It likely is what makes him such a good person in the end. Peter using his powers to win wrestling matches is also something that I was very surprised was so consistent and similar between the comic book and the movie. I didn't know that that was something that went all the way back to the comic book, to the 60s. This is something that only the Tobey Maguire movies stay loyal to, also. Peter uses his heightened intuition and physical strength to win wrestling matches and get money. In the movie, he is specifically getting money so that he can get a car so he can impress MJ because he wants to be with MJ. Also, Uncle Ben dying. Specifically, Uncle Ben dying because Peter let a robber get away after commenting that the robbery isn't his problem. I was very surprised that this was also so... I mean, I figured it... I knew it happened. There's no way it wouldn't happen. It's such an important part. But the exact way it happens is so... They stay so loyal to the comics. I was surprised about that. This teaches Peter a lesson that is important to the entire foundation, which his morals are built on. Peter learns the consequences of vengeance through Uncle Ben's death, and it makes him a more benevolent hero. Another thing is Peter learning the lesson that great power comes with great responsibility. This is learned by Peter following Uncle Ben's death in both versions, and more specifically is learned because of Uncle Ben's death. This is the point in which Peter understands just how much impact his abilities are having on those he loves because of his uncle's demise. This shapes Peter's actions for the rest of his life. Those are all my noted similarities between the comics and the actual movie. All right, now we are going to talk about the notable differences between the comic book and the movie. One difference that I noticed right away is that Peter is a lot nicer and less sexist in the movie than in the comic book. I'm sure this has a lot to do with the comic book being from the 60s, but yeah, he's just generally like very like objectifying toward women, and it's just gross. In the comic book, Peter Parker is actually a very vengeful nerd. He wants to get back at his bullies and sees women as objects more so than people. It makes sense that Peter would be written as less of a good and likable character by our current standards in 1962 when the comic was written, which is likely why the writers opted to change how he treated women and how he generally felt about his bullies. For example, Peter repeatedly asked a girl out in the comic book, showing no respect for her wish to be left alone, causing her to feel harassed. Expressed by the line, "Peter, for the umpteenth time, you're just not my type." Whereas in Spiderman, the 2002 film that we are talking about, Peter is hesitant to even talk to the girl he's in love with, and certainly would never harass her. As evident when Peter and Harry are at the science lab on their field trip, and Harry tells Peter he should talk to Mary Jane Watson, and Peter reacts to the idea as completely preposterous and scary. It makes Peter much more likable for modern audiences that he shows respect for women and a shyness rather than harassing women repeatedly. Also a difference is Peter's love interest being Mary Jane Watson. In the original comic book, Peter asks out Sally, a throwaway character used to show that Peter frequently gets rejected. Since Sally was not a memorable character from the comic series, the creators of Spider-Man decided to make Peter's first love interest the one that Peter actually ends up marrying in the comic books, the fan favorite, Mary Jane Watson. This decision makes a lot of sense, as it would create more excitement among fans for the movie's release. Yeah, so MJ is in the comic books, obviously. She just shows up way later than, like, in high school. She shows up when he's in college. That's also when, like, Harry shows up and everything. It's way later than you would think based on the rest of the media that you see of Spider-Man. Another difference that a lot of people talk about and was brought to light quite a bit in Spider-Man No Way Home is that Peter Parker naturally produces web fluid in the movie, but he doesn't do this in the original comics. This is something that was actually made accurate to the comic books by other Spider-Man films, just not the Tobey Maguire trilogy. It likely increased the runtime of the movie too much to have Peter inventing web fluid and his shooters, and it is more comedic and entertaining to have them naturally come out of him. Causing an accident in the school cafeteria, that gets him into a fight with a bully in the high school hallway, which Peter wins with his amazing acrobatics and spider sense. Also, something that surprised me so much was this difference that Uncle Ben says with great power comes great responsibility in the movie, but he does not say that in the comic book. This came as a massive surprise to me, but in the original comic book, as far as I can tell, Uncle Ben does not at all say this to Peter. In the comic book, Peter comes up with the line himself without having been told it by Uncle Ben within the panels of the comic, whereas in the film, Uncle Ben says it to Peter in the car right before he drops Peter off at the library. They were Uncle Ben's last words that Peter would live by forever. The writers likely made it so that Uncle Ben said this line because it makes Peter's repeating of it more emotional, and as if in honor of his uncle. It really makes it a lot more impactful that he is saying this line because it was his uncle's last words rather than Peter coming up with this kind of mantra just because, like, it is reflective of, like, what he's learned based on his uncle dying. I think it's better if it's both his uncle's last words and what he's learned from his uncle dying. Also, the Green Goblin is a difference. Although the Green Goblin is a common enemy of Spider-Man in the comic books, he does not appear in the very first comic book, which otherwise parallels the movie. It makes sense that the creators of the film made the Green Goblin a part of the story to both provide a parallel to Peter's acquisition of powers and to include another well-known character in the movie. It also helps to provide an antagonist for the film, because the comic book really didn't have an antagonist other than the robber who killed Uncle Ben, and Peter's inner conflict that came from the death. Peter also had the antagonist of just his own low ranking in the school social food chain, but that doesn't exactly sell movie tickets. The Green Goblin allows for a more action-filled movie with yet another familiar character that will get more viewers. Also, Harry Osborn. Although a comic book character, Harry Osborn was not present in the very beginning of Peter Parker's story. Harry, instead, as I said before, first appears in an issue of Spider-Man comics released 3 years after Peter Parker's first appearance. Once again, this allowed for more fan intrigue for the movie, as it included another familiar character for fans, and created more conflict for Peter, due to Peter's antagonist being his best friend's father, which allows for an even more interesting plot for the movie. Lots of added inner conflict that makes for a more interesting story for a movie. And it's just a different medium. I mean, when you have a comic book where you're trying to release things weekly, it makes sense that you're doing small parts of the story, like one bit at a time. But when it's a movie, you want to cram as much interesting stuff in to that hour and a half, 2 hours, 2.5 hours, as you can, because it costs a lot of money to make a movie, and they're not coming out weekly. It's not like this is a TV show. The creators of the film, Spider-Man, changed a lot of things about the story to adapt it to the big screen, which overall allowed for a more interesting and conflict-filled storyline. The only thing that would have been better to stay more accurate to the comic book, in my opinion, would be if they kept it so that Peter Parker made his own web fluid and web shooters in the movie. This would have shown how intelligent, creative, and inventive that Peter Parker is, rather than making it seem like Peter is just a loser in high school. They got lucky with all of his powers. It would have more seemed like he earned some of it by inventing his web abilities himself. Otherwise, every way that the writers adapted the story to the film is absolutely understandable and ideal to make an incredibly great movie, full of heartfelt, emotional moments, life lessons, and love of all kinds. This film is extremely impressive with how emotional the film is, especially for a movie genre generally thought to be action rather than drama. This movie isn't just great by its time's standards, it's fantastic by the standards of today's films, especially today's superhero films. No more recent versions of Peter Parker's story on screen go so in depth about Peter's relationships with his family, friends, and love interests. If you want a superhero movie that has plenty of action but still contains very meaningful and interesting relationship dynamics, life lessons, inner conflicts, and a feeling of emotional authenticity that is unmatched by any film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, then I fully recommend Sam Raimi's Spider-Man.
Hi, I would just like to say thank you so much for watching the video. It's so great getting to talk about one of my top 10, maybe top 5, definitely top 10 favorite movies in so much detail. Yeah, I really had a good time making this. It started out as an assignment that was supposed to be about 2 or 3 pages long, and I ended up writing 11 pages because I just love this movie so much. It's such a big part of my childhood and everything, and it was so fun to write, so fun to just keep rewatching the movie to come up with more points, more things to write about it. And yeah, if you would like to see more content like this, just let me know. Uh, and yeah, thank you so much for watching. And as always, keep stinging honeys. I love you. Sorry, I didn't have good lighting. I didn't have the good lighting for the outro. So, as always, keep stinging honeys. I love you.